Hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of Liberty Watch. I'm your host, Liberty Man Van, where we talk about libertarian principles, mainly the non-aggression principle, which means you can't hit people and you can't take their stuff. We also believe in free association and free markets. So we'll kind of look at some current events today through a libertarian lens. And by the way, sorry I was away for so long. The reason is because my wife was in the hospital for a while with pneumonia. Fortunately, she's doing much better now. She's out of the hospital and headed towards full recovery. So thank God for that. Thank God for wonderful wives. And boy, when she's away, I realize how much she does. She helps me at the office, and she also, of course, does so many things around the house. And of course, when she was down, I was doing the office and the house and the kids, and well, it got just a little bit hectic. Didn't have time to do a show. So anyway, hopefully we'll be able to get into a more regular routine of episodes now. So today is Monday, April 14th, I believe, 15th, 16th, looks like. April 16th, 2018. Now, what we're going to talk about on the show today is there's been another chemical attack in Syria. And so we'll talk about that as Trump considers military action. And also on the agenda for today is Speaker Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, has announced his retirement, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also do a segment on campus insanity, some stories from our crazy leftist campuses. And in there somewhere, we'll throw a little libertarian humor into the mix. And if we have time, we'll talk about a collection of essays called The Myth of National Defense. So let's get started.
And I have to say that all of us who've been seeing the terrible pictures coming out of Syria and Homs recently recognize it is absolutely imperative for the international community to rally and send a clear message to President Assad that it is time for a transition. It is time for that regime to move on.
The transition to democracy in Syria has begun, and it's time for Assad to get out of the way.
Now, our lead story for today is Syria, and there's been a civil war in Syria now for several years. And there are different factions in that conflict. Assad is the ruler there. He's the ruler in Syria, and he's being backed by the Russians and the Iranians. On the other side of the conflict has been ISIS. We've actually been arming ISIS, believe it or not, which is supposed to be our enemy, but since I guess the enemy of our enemy is our friend in that conflict, we ended up backing ISIS for a while. But now they've kind of been run out of town. Fortunately, their influence, they had their own little caliphate going in there in Syria for a while. But they've been driven out, and it looks like Assad's forces in the civil war are right on the verge of victory. And even last week, President Trump announced, kind of hinted that he was about to pull all our forces out of Syria.
And by the way, we're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon.
Which was good news for those of us who are anti-war. However, just a few days after he announced that we might pull out, guess what happens? Another chemical attack in Syria. And as you'll recall, this happened about a year ago. There was another chemical attack. and the United States assumed that it was Assad behind the chemical attack. And because we think ourselves the policemen of the world, you know, we have to right all wrongs. We went in and did a bombing, just launched some bombs into cruise missiles into Syria there. And that was the end of our military action at that point, okay? So Trump is considering military action again. And here's what we know about the chemical attack. It was in a suburb of Damascus called Duma. And some residents heard something falling from the sky, and it was followed by the smell of chlorine, some eyewitnesses said. There was about 70 people that died. The Syrian government and the Russians who were backing the Syrian government, of course, they're denying any culpability whatsoever. They say they didn't do it. They weren't behind the attacks. And no international body has named the culprit at this point. We're still waiting for that information. But the U.S. has already said they believe that Assad was to blame, and we've threatened military action. Again, without having any proof whatsoever that Assad was the culprit. Now, here's why I think we should get out of Syria. It's a civil war for the Syrian people to figure out for themselves. We shouldn't be involved in it. One of the main reasons we said we were going into Syria was to defeat ISIS, and they had that caliphate set up in like western Iraq and eastern Syria there for a while. ISIS has been defeated. So if that was our reason to be there, we should be leaving. And why has that whole region been destabilized anyway? Well, the United States is responsible for destabilizing the whole region by going into Afghanistan, invading Afghanistan, then invading Iraq. So, you know, we just create more and more chaos in the area, and more people die. All right, another reason we don't need to be in there is because if that weren't enough, we have a $20 trillion debt and rising. And this is a very expensive program. The United States military spends as much as the next 8 militaries in the world combined. And yet we're constantly told how our military is underfunded. If we go in there and escalate the conflict, more civilians are going to die. You know, if our stated conflict will probably be something like, oh, you know, this is a chemical attack. We can't let that stand. The international community, blah, blah, blah. So they'll say to protect the people of Syria from Assad. Well, the problem with that rationale is when you escalate tensions in the civil war that's been going on for several years, which just might be over soon, you're going to end up with more civilians in Syria killed, I believe. Another reason we don't like war is because it enhances state power. It draws more resources toward itself. Someone once wrote that war is the health of the state. So true. And going into Syria to get more involved in that civil war there is not going to make Americans safer. If the aim of the military is to protect Americans, Syria is no existential threat to the United States. So there's no rationale in terms of protecting Americans for getting further involved in that conflict. Okay. Now, as it turns out, we have a very long history of tinkering in Syria. Not just recently, but going all the way back at least until the 1940s. And we're going to look at a few instances here. And this is from an article entitled America's Long History of Trying to Determine Who Rules Syria. And The first part is from a 1949 coup. The CIA organized its very first coup in Syria in 1949 to overthrow a democratically elected president and install a military dictator. The U.S. has never given up trying to determine who rules Syria. You remember what President Wilson said, or was it Teddy? One of those two, Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, said we're going to make the world safe for democracy. I believe it was Wilson. Well, if we're trying to trumpet democracy, then why do we topple democratically elected leaders in countries? And this is not the only time it's happened, but just in one example, we also did it in Guatemala. We did it in Iran, all right, in the early 50s. And these are these CIA operations. So anyway, we were behind a 1949 coup in Syria. And there's also the 1986 CIA memo. A CIA document declassified last year exposed a plot to overthrow the Syrian government by provoking sectarian tensions all the way back in 1986. All right, more than 30 years ago. Here are a few of the juicy excerpts. Although we judge that fear of reprisals and organizational problems make a second Sunni challenge unlikely, an excessive government reaction to minor outbreaks of Sunni dissidents might trigger large-scale unrest. In most instances, the regime would have the resources to crush a Sunni opposition movement, but we believe widespread violence among the populace could stimulate large numbers of Sunni officers and conscripts to desert or mutiny, setting the stage for civil war. All right, so it's okay if we start a civil war in another country. We might be able to dictate then who the ruler would be. Okay, and the third part of this article is from a 2007 General Wesley Clark statement. General Wesley Clark made the following statement on Democracy Now! In 2007 about a conversation he had with a general in 2001. He says, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you've got to come in and talk to me a second." He says, "We've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" He said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, "I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran." So there are people in the deep state in Washington, D.C. that have wanted to topple the Syrian regime for decades. And what I'm predicting is that they've got the president's ear. And the next section I wanted to talk about of my comments about Syria is entitled, "Why Trump Probably Won't Say No to the War Hawks." All right. One thing, he's been accused for collusion with the Russians. There's this investigation now, has been going on for over a year, trying to find some connection between the Trump campaign and Russian collusion in the election. Of course, they haven't found anything, but that doesn't matter. That puts Trump on the defensive, and so because he's had these accusations of colluding with Russia, he's going to want to show he can stand up to Russia, you see, and this is an opportunity for him to do so. So that's one reason he's not going to say no to the war hawks, because he wants to show he's not a puppet of Vladimir Putin in Russia. Now, Trump has recently appointed, did I say Trump? President Trump. He has recently appointed John Bolton to be head of the NSA, National Security Agency. Now, he is very hawkish. And John Bolton was in favor of a regime change in Iraq and still says that that was a success. And he's well known to want regime change in Iran and also Syria. And he also wants to scrap the Iran nuclear deal. So, John Bolton is a very hawkish figure. And so if you're bringing this guy in, you're probably heading toward being more hawkish. Another reason he won't say no to the war hawks is because there's a very strong Israel lobby in Washington, okay? They throw around bazillions of dollars in Washington to get things done the way they want them to be done. And they've had an antipathy towards Iran and Hezbollah for a long time. And they've already conducted, the Israelis have, they've already conducted several bombing raids into Syria. So I think Israel lobby is going to be pressing for us to get further involved in that conflict. And Trump has recently ramped up our 17-year involvement in Afghanistan by sending more troops into that quagmire. I think Trump also lacks the self-confidence and the knowledge in foreign affairs to be his own man, so to speak. So he's just kind of flapping in the wind, listening to his advisors, and he's appointed a lot of, generals as advisors. And so it's going to be hard for him to stand up to these people and be his own man, so to speak. And he's also got an ego on him, Trump does. So he's going to want to look like a tough guy here. And so you go to war. Now, what's the excuse for military action going to be? I discussed this a little bit earlier. It's going to be something like, he's chemical attacking his own people. Doesn't matter whether that's been proven or not. That's going to be the excuse. We got to protect them, Never mind, more people are probably going to die because of the escalation. So this whole excuse is going to be just a bunch of baloney. But that's probably what the excuse is going to be, something like that. Now, how about the timing of the attack? I'm predicting he goes ahead and moves real soon before anybody's able to figure out that maybe Assad was not behind the attacks, and then he won't have an excuse to attack. So I'm betting it happens sooner rather than later. And when I wrote all of that for my presentation for you, Trump had not yet taken any action. Well, let's add an addendum here. I'm a little bit further in time now, so my predictions were correct. Trump could not resist, and he's bombed supposedly some chemical weapons depots and so forth around Damascus, Syria. And so that's where we are now. Our second story is about the announced retirement of Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. And we're going to talk about how he has affected outcomes in the nation's capital by looking at some cartoons. And these I'll comment on these cartoons, and they pretty much tell the story of Paul Ryan. He is a typical rhino, Republican in name only, because Republicans are supposed to be, you know, deficit hawks. And that's how Ryan, that's how he made his reputation, was being talking a good game. You know, Republicans, we've talked about this before, Republicans always talk a good game about being deficit hawks and worried about the federal deficit and the debt, but they never do anything about it when they have power. And this is just a great example of it. Okay, we talked about on another show the recently passed budget, how it's going to explode the budget. And, you know, it's going to explode the budget at a time when you have a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. So those of you who are holding out for hope that your Republican friends are going to be fiscally responsive, just give it up. It's never going to happen. Paul Ryan is just the poster boy for that. Okay, so let's look at these cartoons now. And this first cartoon implies that Ryan will kill Medicare. So he was going to reform Medicare, do some Medicare reforms, which are badly needed, by the way. These federal spending programs, unless we start limiting their damage on the debt, are just going to bring the whole financial house of cards down. So the responsible thing to do would be to start reforming Medicare now, but of course nothing responsible ever happens in Washington. So although Ryan talked tough about Medicare, he never intended to end the Medicare program and never said he would. He did talk of reforming the program so as to try to tame the federal debt. In the end, he nor his Republican colleagues never had the guts. Now, this next cartoon implies that Ryan will help repeal Obamacare and give the savings to the rich. And this is the way, of course, the Republicans we're not going to do any such thing. But anytime you cut or reduce the rate of increase, they don't even cut these programs. They keep going up and up every year. So if they just even cut the rate of increase, they'll be attacked as being in favor, you know, these Republicans are just going to rob from the poor, take their program away and give it to the rich. That's how it's always going to be caricatured by the Democrats. And the Democrats don't have anything to worry about. Republicans are just as big government as they are. The next cartoon says, I love deficits. This one has a lot of truth to it, as we've already talked about. Although he talked a good game, he never got around to presiding over any kind of decrease in the federal budget. And this next cartoon says, House under new management influenced by the far right. Well, far right is just a code word for racist. But Ryan was not a racist. He was not of the far right. He was a centrist, okay? And to say that the House was under new management, no. This is the same old management, just a different name at the head of it. Our next cartoon says, new budget does not kill Obamacare, right? See the hearse ready to take it away, but no, it wasn't to be done. And although Trump ran on repealing Obamacare, he, along with the GOP, controlled the House and Senate, and they never even came close to repealing Obamacare. Now, they did repeal a few of the provisions, but the biggest bulk of that thing remained intact, and Republicans and the president never had any intention of repealing that whole thing. The next cartoon implies that Medicare recipients should watch out. And there's a couple of cartoons here that portray that same message. And I say, are you kidding? Medicare reform by either party will never happen before the U.S. government bankruptcy. And that's when they'll stop spending too much. If minor reform does occur, they will simply be rearranging the chairs on the Titanic that is the federal debt. Did I mention the federal debt? Now for a little libertarian humor. All right, now this cartoon shows a graphic of a lifeguard watching as several bodies are floating in the pool. And the caption reads, "Libertarians make bad lifeguards." Now this is a caricature of the libertarian position because we don't believe people should be coerced at the point of a gun into contributing to these giveaway programs, these wealth redistribution programs. We don't believe that people should have their money taken away from them by force and given to someone else. And somehow that means that libertarians don't believe in charity. Well, that's baloney. Because you don't believe in government charity doesn't mean you don't believe in charity. And of course the caricature is always that if you don't want to support the government doing X, Y, or Z, then therefore you're opposed to X, Y, and Z. This is a common caricature of libertarians. Our next section is entitled Campus Insanity, and these are some stories and headlines I'm going to read you and a few snippets of articles regarding these headlines I think you'll find, I don't know if they're funny, tragic, or however you want to look at it. Our first article is entitled, Temple University faculty members are trying to erase the gender binary system. That's right. You know, boy and a girl, male, female. The gender binary refers to the traditional classification of human gender into two distinct categories, masculine and feminine. Some professors at Temple University are looking to erase this outdated classification altogether. Heath Fogg Davis, a professor of political science at Temple, argues in his new book that he wants to live in a world in which everyone uses a gender-neutral pronoun. He says, quote, "My argument in the book is not that we try to live beyond gender, but to minimize the formal use of gender and gender policies because of the way it infringes on people's individual autonomy," Davis said. "In an ideal world, I wish that we all used a gender-neutral pronoun." All right. Our next campus headline is entitled, Students Accused of Hatred for Defending Traditional Marriage. And the article says, LGBT students That's right. LGBT students are attempting to defund Love Saxa, a Georgetown University student group that supports traditional marriage. Love Saxa's mission statement says the group exists to promote healthy relationships on campus through cultivating a proper understanding of sex, gender, marriage, and family among Georgetown students. Love Saxa's mission statement says the group exists to promote healthy relationships on campus through cultivating a proper understanding of sex, gender, marriage, and family among Georgetown students. Jasmine Youssef submitted a formal notice to the university on September 25th on the grounds that Love Sachs's definition of marriage fosters hatred and intolerance, which would violate Georgetown's student organization standards. Next headline. Feminist professor says traditional science is rooted in racism. That's right. Science is racist. A feminist professor at the University of California, Davis has vowed to challenge the authority of science by rewriting knowledge through a feminist lens. Sarah Giordano argues that traditional science relies on a colonial and racialized form of power and must be replaced with an anti-science, anti-racist, feminist approach to knowledge production. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. I'm not making this up. Next one. Okay, we're going to finish on this one from Harvard University. Thinking about sending the kids to Harvard? Well, you might not after this next headline. Here goes. Harvard hosts anal sex workshop entitled What in the Butt? That's right. You heard it here first. What in the butt? As a part of Harvard University's Sex Week, the Ivy League institution hosted an anal sex workshop entitled What in the Butt? Anal 101. The workshop taught students how to put things in their butt, according to a report from the College Fix. As with most proceedings at Harvard, the anal sex workshop placed great emphasis on equality. After the presenter noted that not all men have penises, not all women have vaginas. She argued that the butthole is the great sex equalizer. All humans have a butthole. And that's our show for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell a friend. You can find us, tell a friend, and you can find us online at libertymanvan.com. That's my blog. And from the blog, you can click on links to get to my videos. And I have my own YouTube channel. It's Liberty Man Van, 3 words. So you should be able to type that in. And also in my blog, you'll find if you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel, you can click on a link in order to do that. So spread the word, tell some friends, and try to grow the show. Thanks again for joining us. You be sure to be here next time on Liberty Watch, where we don't believe you need some guy with a bullhorn to tell you what to do.